Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today is for another moral philosophy video. What specifically? Well, I'm going to be talking about moral relativism. If you don't know what moral relativism is, I'll give you a really quick, to the best of my ability, of a rundown on basically what that entails. So, essentially, moral relativism talks about how there are actually no moral universal truths anywhere. It makes the case that what gets determined morally is always based on context. So you can say this specific situation, or you can say this culture, that society, yada, 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 so on and so forth. So basically, rules do not apply in the same way when it comes to moral foundations. Now, a lot of people have an issue with this. I guess more so specifically moral realists. I made a video, which you should also check out, talking about why I think normative ethics fails when it comes to, being spouted on by people that are moral realists. But I never really touched on this particular topic. And the reason why I wanted to talk about moral relativism specifically, because I think it gives us a lot of things to consider based on, yes, from a moral anti-realist point of view, the foundation of some kind of like objective morality is very shaky and it is very flimsy. So I guess to, top it all off, I think it does point out that from, this perspective, considering moral relativism, and especially since this is how the world operates, I'll just give, like some examples. Like in the United States, certain laws may not apply in certain states because certain states have different rules. Certain things in different countries might fly by or they don't, depending on the laws in that jurisdiction, whatever, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. So how is it that you can be in a certain place, a certain situation, a certain context, let's just say, and if you break a certain rule that is forbidden in that certain place, that certain situation, that certain context, oh, you face consequences for it. Whereas if you were to do the same thing somewhere else where it is not considered frowned upon, it is not considered illegal, then everybody's day would just go about as if nothing illegal obviously occurred. So there are basically no, steady foundations to morality, if you ask me. And basically, this all comes down to power. If you break a certain rule or a certain law in a situation or context where it is considered that you should not break this rule, this foundation, or whatever, then those in charge, those in those in power will, deal with you, so to speak. But the people who don't consider that terrible, who are also in power, who also have, the authority to quote unquote like do something about it, if they don't consider it wrong in another situation, context, or place, they're not going to do anything towards you. So basically, all of this points out that a lot of people's, like moral foundations, like rules and like regulations, you know, obviously is only attributed to their culture, their society, or whatever. And it points out the fallacious appeal to majority fallacy, which is what I think moral relativism does a pretty good job at doing. So it doesn't actually answer the meta ethical question in terms of, okay, what quote unquote objectively determines what is considered right or wrong, because self confirmation bias is again self confirmation bias. Just because it's okay in this place, situation, or context by a certain group of people, and it's not okay in this certain place, situation, or context for this group of people, all of that is basically just an appeal to majority fallacy. If you're relying on what the majority says in any given context, you're not actually, substantially answering the meta ethical question in terms of, okay, how is this objectively morally wrong? And I would argue that there is no such thing as something objectively, morally wrong, because all, moral statements are projected. All moral statements are essentially made up and decided by people arbitrarily. So that's basically also what's fallacious about laws in general, because, laws are supposedly created for, there to be quote unquote like a fair society. But just because, again, it still follows the same problem, just because it's going to take this like utilitarian approach where, okay, sure, maybe a majority of people think that you ought to follow these rules, majority of people think that, okay, this is how it ought to be. It doesn't satisfactorily, it doesn't give satisfaction in answering, okay, from a, meta ethical point of view, why is it objectively morally wrong, so to speak. So even when it comes to religion, I find this, like really, really funny because a lot of like, religious people tend to be continental philosophers. Like when you take philosophy, for example, there's like people that are lean more to the analytic lens. I'm more of an analytical philosopher myself when I do my philosophy, so to speak. But I've noticed that when it comes to a lot of religious people, a lot of like spiritual people, they prefer to take a more like continental route. Let me know if you'd want me to make a video specifically where I expand upon why I don't really understand continental philosophy, or at least, like why I'm more on the analytical side of philosophy rather than the continental side. But basically, because a lot of religious people are these, like continental, philosophers and whatnot, I don't understand how exactly that they're going to come about saying that, like, okay, you have a true religious, like foundation to dictate that, okay, God is an objective, like, moral arbiter. But when they take the continental route, basically, when it comes to, for example, like meaning making, because I would say that coming from a nihilistic lens myself, that fits more to an analytical lens that, oh, okay, you can't actually prove a foundation of like any, sort of like meaning. And because we're talking about, like morality here, another like meta ethical, theory that I've done a video on, which I suggest that you also check out if you want to see me like further expand upon that, is basically my take on moral nihilism, for example. So that's basically a moral anti-realist position. But why is it that when it comes to, religious people, so to speak, their God is supposedly okay, like a definitive, like sort of like arbiter, but yet they take the continental route that just your personal experience, your soul, your essence, your whatever. So they very much like lean towards like something subjective, which I see as kind of like a cop out because it seems like they pick and choose depending on, oh, subjectivity is special because we have a soul, we have this, we have blah blah blah, or like whatever. But no, there has to be some sort of like objective standard to something, so therefore we need a god. So basically, from the looks of it, if you ask me, they kind of just pick and choose which one seems a bit more convenient to them. And oh, if you do check out my video on emotivism, I actually also point this out when I talk about a lot of like religious people and whatnot. It's funny and hilarious how everybody's god already aligns with like the values and truths at which they hold. And essentially, okay, so basically, I remember a conversation that I had, not that recently with some friends on Discord, and we were talking about, Christianity specifically. And I mentioned, and which I thought should be, brought upon by like this video, religion, if you ask me, is still not a good way to determine basically any sort of like objective, like moral standard whatsoever. And even within religion, morality is still relative, and the point of moral relativism can still be shown. So essentially, I'd say one of the biggest reasons there are so many Christian denominations, for example, or there's this whole thing about like, oh, not all Muslims are terrorists, blah blah blah, whatever. See, like not all Muslims are terrorists, but obviously there are still Muslims or people that support Islam that have, you can say, like violent sort of like beliefs, quote unquote. Sure, that doesn't apply to everybody, but that's kind of what I'm saying. So essentially, even within morality, it's still relative. So sure, for example, even with Christians, they can all read the Bible as much as they want. And, okay, and specifically, this is why I wanted to bring up basically like continental versus analytic philosophy, because, for example, a lot of religious people that are continental philosophers, which a lot of them are for the most part, will bash on analytic philosophy because they say that, oh, it's so annoying, you keep asking me the definitions for stuff, you keep picking at semantics, you keep like blah blah blah, we're not having like a real conversation, so to speak, which I never really understood because when I see language, it's just attempting to define things, right? It's just attempting to, like make definitions of like certain things. So I don't see it as a pivot to ask people for semantics, like their definitions, their connotations, or like whatever, because clearly when people are arguing, about the Bible or even about the Quran, how to supposedly, interpret like religious sort of like scripture and text, you have to go through some sort of like analytic philosophical conversation, and this opens another can of worms that religious people don't like, which is basically, if you're going to hate on philosophy, or particularly if you're going to hate like analytic philosophy, then who cares about the Bible? Because the one of the main reasons why there are so many denominations of Christianity and why they might believe certain things regardless of like what it is. I'm not going to talk about like anything specific per se, but basically it's because not all denominations interpret the Bible in the same way. So it's ridiculous to me when a lot of like religious people, a lot of like so-called Christians are like, "Oh, just read the Bible. Have you ever even read the Bible?" Or when they say things like, "Oh, you clearly haven't read the Bible, or you haven't given like the like the Bible a chance, or like any sort of like variation of that." Okay, anyone can read the Bible, and then we can get into this conversation about like, okay, how do we interpret this like quote unquote like text, so to speak. You can tell me I'm wrong, but perhaps maybe there's another denomination that's going to agree with how I interpret the Bible, even though I'm not a very like religious person or anything like that. Or let's just say if I was pretending, so to speak, like if I had to put myself in like the best capability, this is what I think this text is saying, and we can get into all this argument about like, okay, is this supposed to be literal? Is this supposed to be metaphorical? Does it even have a good translation to begin with? Because the Bible, obviously it wasn't written in like English, obviously. We translated it through like a variety of languages, and again, that brings up another philosophical discussion about like the philosophy of language, so to speak, because how do we interpret definitions? We're using like, okay, we see flaws in our language, yet we have no choice but to use the language itself to try and figure out and uncover the flaws, so to speak. So the Bible itself is just as relative of a moral foundation for morality than anything else that exists in the world. It's hilarious how religious people want to talk like, oh, you're consumed by like worldly pleasures or worldly, like, oh yeah, because like we're more than our physical bodies, so to speak, or whatever kind of like jibber jabber that like they want to talk about. But essentially, the rise in denominations, in Christian denominations and different interpretations is because, okay, yes, we are grounded by this worldly thing that we're a part of, that you want to somehow talk like, oh, there's something more than that, even though, there isn't. And especially, I don't give a shit if you want to consider yourself non-denominational, because basically, there are these Christians that say, "Oh, we're just non-denominational. We don't belong to religion. We just believe in Jesus." Like they have a problem with like the word like religion, for example, and like yeah, again, it's gonna go to the whole like semantics, blah blah blah, or like whatever. But I'm using religion to obviously just mean people that believe in some sort of like deity that they worship, or some sort of like creator, essentially. It's like basically a normal definition. I would imagine that is not honestly that difficult to pick up, because yeah, I've spoken to some of you, and it's like, oh, it's not religion, it's just a relationship with Jesus or God, or like however the fuck you want to spin it in a way that, oh, sounds more nicer to like your delivery or whatever. So basically, yeah, even religion itself, that which is supposedly credited for some kind of like moral sort of like objective standard, really doesn't even make any sense. And I loved the part in the debate with debate discussion, whatever it was. I didn't actually watch the whole thing, but I watched enough to get to the part where, okay, what I'm talking about is the discussion between Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor, also known as Cosmic Skeptic, whereas he basically points out like, oh, you were saying that like what's credited towards religion is like having some sort of like objective moral foundation, but if you look at like the scripture and like the text or like whatever, then oh, it was a different time back then. So, oh yeah, exactly. When it comes to like a lot of like religious texts, a lot of religious people will say, oh, you have to consider how it was different then, or it's not the same standards that like we have now, blah blah blah, or like whatever. But then, as Alex said to Ben Shapiro, who's the moral relativist now? Who is the moral who's the moral relativist now? So yeah, I wanted to make this video to get people to like sort of like think about that. And oh, another thing. I was about to end this video, but I really did want to include something else. I see that a lot of people have issues with moral relativism, because I don't remember what paper it was or what argument specifically it was called, but I did watch a video that where somebody, brought this up. It was by some religious person talking about how like, oh, believing in not believing in God, atheism leads to like moral nihilism. But I remember like a specific part in that video where he brings up something that was like, basically an issue with moral relativism is because you can't actually call something progress if something is just considered right or wrong at this specific time or at this, certain context. Because yes, that's how moral relativism works. Like it's just the parameters in which everything is specifically happening in, a certain context to determine a supposed like right or wrong, like moral foundation, quote unquote, or, whatever. But I mean, I just want people to also consider something else. How do you know you actually have the intellectual capability to understand what progress is? Because when judge something from the past and say that, oh, we've made a lot of progress since then, or people back then were, completely misguided or like whatever, well, we still function the same way that like they do. If you condemn something in the past that isn't socially and morally acceptable in the current society now, you're following the same foundation in the sense where it's like, okay, this is not good for society. Whatever they did back then, people also thought that, okay, we need to do this because it would better society, quote unquote. Like whatever it is that you're calling wrong now, it wasn't considered wrong to those people because keeping that order was their definition of, a society that will flourish and a society that will like function, so to speak, especially since okay, they lived in a time where that was normal, so there was barely anybody to contradict that. Again, the self confirmation bias, still happened, blah blah blah, whatever, and like stuff like that. And even up until up until now, whatever you're condemning back then, it's because throughout your life in this current era, it has been reinforced your entire life that basically, oh, a certain way of thinking is like, is like right, and what they thought back then was, wrong, or, blah blah blah. So how do you know you can actually make the distinction that this is a progressive like belief? That's something that like I like seriously wonder, because it's kind of hilarious because like sure, there's conflict, blah blah blah, or whatever, all that kind of stuff. But like think about when someone says, okay, get with the times, grandpa, because they're living in like an older age, or when people say something like, oh, it's insert blah blah blah, like this like current year or like whatever. Yeah, all they're saying is, okay, yeah, things work differently in the present moment than they did in the past. But you've never had to weigh living like that truly. So of course it's easy for you to think that whatever is happening right now has to be, some sort of like objective, solid, like foundation. I mean, again, I'm not saying you can't have certain like morals or like whatever just because okay, there's no like foundation to it. But I'm saying that it's just there's just no foundation to actually call anything like objective like whatsoever. Because again, you didn't live during a time where it was pressured, it was socialized, it was okay for like, for you to like think a certain way. So basically, what progression did you actually do? So like when people say, okay, society has like, progressed compared to like what it was like, let's say like 400 years ago, like, okay, you can call that progression, but you did not actually progress into anything. You're still just a product of like the current time, just like those people were a product of the current time when their time was still the current time. So yeah, I think considering moral relativism overall, it does a really, good job at showing the shaky and flimsy way that people, do not have any objective morality as much as they want to believe or think that they do.